Hi, I'm Rachel, and this is my AM reading video for Friday, June 26th, 2026, going up on a Saturday and also filmed on a Saturday, which in this case is me trying to get myself back onto a better schedule from my last week's AM reading, which was technically not yet a week ago, but we are now reaching the end of June, so I gotta, keep to my schedule here. And anyway, otherwise, I don't know what the lighting looks like. I had to turn on some artificial lights, even though it's the morning, but it's overcast, it's rainy, it's summer. Well, it might not be rainy yet, but it probably will be. Hopefully the nice days will return as well, probably a little bit hotter. And that's where we are. Anyway, to get to the point here, I start these reading videos by reviewing a short story in a literary magazine, and currently I am reading from Frankly Feminist, short stories by Jewish women from Lilith magazine. So I feel like this counts. And this week I read Max's Mom Goes to Camp by Judith Zimmer. So I really, I appreciate the opening of this story where this anxious woman is driving up to Parents' Day at camp. So naturally, you might assume her child is one of the children, one of the campers, I should say. But actually, her son Max is one of the counselors. But she is very worried about him, and this is an environment that she didn't put him in when he was younger, and she's thinking about that. She's also divorced. I don't know how long she's been divorced, but she's self-conscious about it, and her husband is remarried, and somebody refers to her by her, her married name is still her name. But yeah, she's also anxious about Max himself, who seems to kind of have been flighty. He was in college, but he basically had to drop out because he wasn't attending to what he was supposed to be attending to, and this camp counselor experience was trying like a way to get him back on track so that maybe he could get back into, school the next year. So she comes to Parents' Day because he gets a couple of hours off, and so they go out for breakfast together, and then he takes her to the lake to swim. And all in all, it seems like a really happy experience. She sees that he's confident ordering, his breakfast at this place they go to in town, and that, he just is, at peace and confident in the water. But then he lays on her that he and his girlfriend have decided they're going to move in together, and he's going to take another year off of school, and that freaks her out a bit. But, he's kind of saying the platitudes of things that he, has learned in order to corral 13-year-olds at camp, like the deeds, not words. And then by the time he has to leave to resume his duties, he's being surrounded by his campers and by their parents. And I think seeing him in that authoritarian position, I think lets her realize she can take a step back. And this is the one part of the story that sort of explicitly links to Judaism, when this character thinks to a verse in the Kabbalah about taking steps back after reciting the Kaddish, and it's about having a separation between things and giving the world some space. And so she's using this metaphorically to try to also give her son some space to be an adult. So I thought this was just a nice story. It's kind of contemporary. It probably could have taken place anytime in the last 30, 40 years sometime, but I just thought this was just a nice story. Next, I finished Our Little Histories by Janice Weizman, which was my Buzzwordathon cover pick for the month, and I talked about it briefly at the end of my last AM reading video. So this is a Jewish family drama story, much more overtly Jewish. It's multi-generational. We start in the present day, and actually we're following some characters around. There's distant cousins, some from the US, some from Israel, but they meet in near Minsk in Belarus, where some of their ancestors came from, and they're enacting this sort of museum-like ritual about Jewish life in the area in the 19th century, and the experience starts to kind of feel circus-like not actually telling the truth of who, or the whole truth, the nuanced truth of who their ancestors were, and also, what they know about them, which isn't a huge amount, but these two sets of cousins do have a set of poetry that was published in 1917, and it obviously comes from a same ancestor because they have the same poetry collection. And so in the next, chapters, we go further and further back in the past. There's a family tree, a detailed family tree in the front of the book, which details, the family going back to the first generation that's going to be chronicled here, which in essence is three brothers who grew up in the mid-19th century in a small shtetl. That would be a Jewish village in what's now Belarus and now what then would have, been the Russian Empire. But we also, go back in time, like in increments, to the children and grandchildren, great-grandchildren, etc. of these original three brothers who were actually twins, triplets. And so one branch of their family ultimately moves to the U.S., one branch ultimately moves to Israel, although at the time it was the Mandate of Palestine, and then one family stayed in Europe and was wiped out in the Holocaust. And so we see characters from various points in this history, these descendants, and get a fuller sense of what their lives and experience were actually like. And it covers a lot. It covers religious Judaism, it covers socialism and the rise of Zionism, it covers the kibbutz movement of the 60s and where it is in Israel, and how it's how sort of the anti-diasporic feeling manifests by that time, especially as people are still dealing with the losses of the Holocaust and their families that they lost. And then there's a little bit in the U.S., not quite as much, but there is a chapter in the 30s, and it also is dealing with the sense of loss that, American culture is kind of pushing out, Yiddish culture and what that means. And so I found this book pretty moving. Maybe it was a little bit pat in some cases, although at the same time, this is where my family comes from. The exact areas that are chronicled in this book, the Ashkenazi areas, I should say, of what's now Lithuania and what's now Belarus, that is where my family came from. And I don't actually know much about that history either, so I do know I have a sort of biased interest in fictionalizing what, family life would have been like then. And so the provenance of the poetry that came into that 1917 pamphlet is this story from the mid-19th century where the mother of these three triplets is trying to devise a way to save her sons from the Tsar's army, because the Jews were, preyed on very heavily to send their sons into the army, which the army training and so forth was brutal enough as it is, but there was that added element, a very brutal element as well, similar to like the re-education camps. So for indigenous populations in North America, it was an attempt to, erase their Jewish identity of these children. And so she devises a plan for her three triplets to split them up in order to save them, and that's kind of how their lines branch off in the future too. And this does make me think of something in my family history that I don't have concrete evidence of, but my mother's father's last name is a German Jewish name, so for a while I assumed that he was of German Jewish stock, but actually, at least as far as my research goes, that's not true. He comes from from the Pale of Settlement, from, the Russian Empire of old. And one reason that Russian Jews at the time changed their surnames to Germanic ones was to save their sons from the army. So as that siren blares outside that you may or may not hear, I'm ruminating on this theory that maybe that's why my mother's grandfather's family name turned into a German one, which was Weinstein, and then was changed to Weinstein when they came to the U.S. So yeah, really fascinating, kind of moving history, and I guess this is the second book I've read by Janice Weizman. She wrote a really fun, interesting book that actually took place in 9th century Babylonia you know, which was really fun to go back to that time, although I admit I think the characters in that story acted a little bit too anachronistically, a little too modern, but I don't think we really have that problem with this much more recent history. And as a final note, I think that book was republished, and then this book was published by a small press, Toby Press, so I'll link to them down below. Next, I'll head on to an audiobook. This is Jean by Madeleine Dunnigan, which I read this month in part because it was on my 2026 anticipated releases. I first mentioned it in my first video of the year, and also I figured this was apropos timing because this is a queer coming-of-age novel of sorts, and June is Pride Month. So anyway, this is a slight literary fiction novel, comings out for this main character, Jean, that I heard about in passing as I was researching 2026 releases that might catch my fancy. And this one caught it because it's what I would call nominally Jewish. There is some Jewish backstory for this main character, Jean. He is growing up in 1970s UK, but his mother is a German Jew, and he faces some prejudice about that, and he has some history of family that was lost in the Holocaust, but otherwise he doesn't have a lot of Jewish background, except for anecdote about one of the men who helped him realize his sexuality, in part by, you know, abuse, as in, you know, a child and an adult reaching out to a child, but this adult had some Jewish ancestry as well, so, you know, we got a little bit more into a tiny bit of Jewish history in the UK, which was not all that important to the story overall. The story now mostly takes place, I think, in 1973, when Jean is about 16. He's sort of seen as a delinquent boy. He'd been kicked out of schools, various schools, and his love is sort of the countercultural London area, but right now he's in a rural boarding school for boys. Has a very sort of outdoorsy element where they go out and they have these sort of festivals that almost feel pagan, with jumping over fires and that sort of thing. And they go out camping on their own a lot. And into this environment, you know, he's had some burgeoning sexual experiences with men, but now he has his first sexual experience with a peer named Tom, who is a different class. Jean is lower class, and Tom is, you know, a higher class. This is a, you know, an English boarding school novel, so that comes out a little bit. There's tension, there's flirtation. It's private because, you know, obviously a gay relationship wouldn't have been accepted out in the open, but they're experimenting with each other, and then there's just a lot of the general angst and drama of being teenagers, and Jean still kind of acts out and doesn't necessarily have a great, you know, sort of personal center of control, but also, you know, he's kind of a victim of some of the other boys as well. Yeah, you know, it's sort of a slight novel. I'm trying to get my head around it, but I didn't like it as much, I think, as I hoped to. I don't think it had a lot of connective, cohesive tissue. And it kind of is reminding me that this is like becoming a pattern, but every year or so it seems like lately I've picked a literary fiction novel that I wanted to read, and then Eric Carl Anderson reads it first and gives it an review, and I find myself generally agreeing with him to a certain extent, so maybe I'm leaning on him a little too much as I'm trying to gather my own thoughts, but I'll leave his review down below because, you know, he is a prominent, you know, a very thoughtful booktuber who reads a lot of literary fiction like this. So, I mean, I'm glad I gave it a go, but, you know, it doesn't really stand out too much to me. And finally, the book I'm in the middle of now is The Calculus of Change by Jessie Hilb. This is one of my top of the Goodreads books. It's a resolution I have every year to skim the titles off the top of my Goodreads TBR that have been there the longest. So this is a YA book. It's kind of similar in a way to Jean because it's a coming-of-age story, except that the main character here is definitely straight and definitely in a US school environment, not a boarding school environment either. But in general, what she's dealing with is, well, her mother died of cancer about 10 years ago, And she's getting this crush on a classmate, Tate, that she's trying to tutor in calculus, which she loves and Tate struggles with. Tate recently came back from a Birthright Israel trip. I didn't realize they did them for high schoolers. And, you know, he had transformative experience, and I don't know, he already had, you know, some religious, you know, background or education, went to synagogue, but now he's wearing his kippah or yarmulke everywhere. And in part, Aiden, our main character, is drawn to that because her mother was Jewish, although she and her remaining family, well, her father isn't Jewish and they're not practicing, but that's one thing that's kind of going on, although for the most part she's just kind of crushing on this guy. And she's also flitting around to other things, like to her best friend and her best friend's love life, which kind of intersects with her brother and her brother's love life. So yeah, it's a very flighty novel, and the chapters are short and easy to get through. It's sort of a YA style, which in all honesty, I got to admit, maybe by this point in my life, it doesn't really speak to me as much anymore. You know, we're just not, we're flitting around a little too much, not getting too deep in. Maybe I'll feel different later when I get further into the book. I plan to report back, because even though this is the last of my June AM reading videos, I'm going to continue the habit that I've started at the beginning of this year, and I'll do a final June reading wrap-up video at the beginning of July. But before I get to that, I will be coming back with my final video of June, which should be my mid-year check-in freakout tag, which I get very excited about. I have gathered a large pile of books that I want to talk about in my various tag prompts that I'll be doing, so stay tuned for that one. It's a fun way to, you know, end the first half of the year as we all, you know, gasp about where the time is gone. But that's what life is. Hopefully I plan to keep going and keep reading as I can as I go, and hopefully have good experiences from that. And I hope that your reading experiences have been great as well. So thanks so much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.